Around the turn of the century, Smith & Wesson would release perhaps the finest commercial revolver ever made. But could this fancy six-gun survive the Great War? Hi, I'm Othais, and this is the pistol Smith & Wesson 4.55" with 6 1/2" barrel Mark I. This is the triple lock. Let's get it over the light box so you can see it more clearly. Weighing in at 2.3 pounds and with an overall length of 11.6 inches, this is a bit lighter but a bit longer than our last wheel gun. It chambers 6 4.55 British cartridges in its swing-out simultaneous eject cylinder. Alright gang, we've discussed the big bore double-action Colts in a previous episode. Today we'll finally get to hear the story of Smith & Wesson, a company we've already discussed a few times in this series. As a matter of fact, this gun is really similar to the K-Frame that we already covered back in episode 42, but let's do a quick recap. Winding back, this is the Smith & Wesson No.3 single-action top-break revolver that served in Russia through the Great War. We've talked about it before in some detail as well. It was chambered for the .44 Russian cartridge, a powerful, large-bore black powder metallic handgun round, one that was popular both in civilian and military circles. The No.3 would be improved further to create the single-action New Model, a gun we saw adopted in the Ottoman Empire, albeit in the older .44 rimfire cartridge. Now, many people consider the Smith & Wesson No.3 series to be the pinnacle of single-action handguns. Others might argue for the Colt's solid frame, but it's hard to beat that rapid loading of the top break design, one that allowed simultaneous ejection and quick replacement of new cartridges. While possibly one of the best for that era, the Smith & Wessons were not the end of all handgun development, and soon European designs started to overtake them with one key feature, that's double action. Guns like the Gasser, Chamberlain, and Nagant, these were winning military contracts rapidly. Reloading wasn't half as good as rapid fire. As we saw a few episodes back, Colt would have to adapt to this issue in the late 1870s, but Smith & Wesson was a bit more innovative in their thinking. They had already been trialing a double action internally, one that they had cooked up to lure the Russians into another contract. James H. Bullard had sketches for a double-action top-break revolver as far back as 1872, and these would be evolved before his departure in 1880 into a new model. This became the No.2 double action, a 5-shot 38 caliber. It was released in January of 1880. The next year, they would scale it up to fit the .44 Russian cartridge, making the confusingly named first model double action, also known as the New Model Navy No.3, thanks to some Russian trialing. Now that gun and a slightly stretched version in .44-40, known as the Frontier, they sold okay in the commercial market, but never saw any real material success, certainly not what Smith & Wesson was hoping for anyway. We actually saw these guns, by the way. They were cloned by the Spanish in order to create the ONA system that the British used during the war. But what Smith & Wesson wanted right now was a Colt Buster. This time around, the US Armed Forces weren't as interested though in a big bore handgun. Instead, their next trial focused on single and double action with rapid reloading and a small bore 38 cartridge. Company founder Daniel Wesson, who we've detailed plenty before, headed up designing the new system. Adapting the No.2 with an emphasis on safety, he created this, the New Departure, more commonly known as the safety hammerless or lemon squeezer. In .38 Smith & Wesson, it competed to be the official handgun of the US Army. Unfortunately, what would be the Colt New Army had the edge with a more powerful cartridge and full top strap, making it stronger overall. Rapid reloading came from a swing-out cylinder. foiled again, but I think you guys are starting to get the pattern here. Smith & Wesson really goes all out for precision machining and highbrow ideals on handling the firearm. They were early to rapid loading. They were fairly early to double action, but the execution on both were not yet perfect, and sadly, they were going to have to concede a point to Colt and adopt a swing-out cylinder. There was no way that they could avoid the superior strength and longevity of a solid frame design. In 1895, they launched the hand ejector, at first in .32. The action was covered in an 1894 patent. It appears, like the previous Colt we saw, to be a modified Galland action, although this time not from the Daguerre model. Instead, this was an evolution of the earlier model 1868, so that means that both Colt and Smith & Wesson are using evolutions of designs from Galland, and therefore sharing something of a common ancestor. Now I want to be clear, the further I get into revolver history, the more I'm actually starting to understand this stuff. If I could get the time, I'd actually like to animate a lot of these actions, because I think the current understanding is a little shallow in just how many of these little exchanges have happened over the years. Anyway, Smith & Wesson would soon scale their new hand ejector up just a tad, which started with the Smith & Wesson Model 1899, a .38 caliber revolver with a unique cylinder release. The push-forward button has an extension on the rear, which blocks the hammer travel when the cylinder is not locked in place, an excellent out-of-battery safety. They still, however, suffered one problem. Unlike Colt, they had not yet moved away from having the hand push the cylinder away, and they were still pushing out to the left, the direction of the closing crane. As we can see, this can be an issue, as using the revolver will slowly put it out of time. Instead of switching sides like Colt, Daniel Wesson opted to add a lug to the barrel. This meant that the cylinder axis pin was held both front and rear, and not just that, but it's actually held in 2 points at the front if you look closely. Yeah, as we'll see, that first patent comes back around later, but it actually wasn't initially used by Smith & Wesson. Instead, they went with something slightly simpler, much easier to manufacture. Daniel filed a patent just 2 weeks later, as a matter of fact, for this version, which was a lot tidier. It only locked in 2 places. Still, it seemed to do the job. Yeah, that seems a bit complicated, especially when you could have just spun the hand the other way into the frame, but Smith & Wesson seems to have a long-standing tradition of over-engineering their way out of trouble, and it doesn't stop there. They added chafing pins, roll pins driven through the hammer and the trigger placed to provide the smoothest bind-free operation possible. Now that's a lot of ground to cover quickly, and all of those things have been mentioned in other episodes in much better detail. Basically, we're looking at the history of the Smith & Wesson all the way up to the K-Frame, which was then cloned over to create this gun, sort of, and then a few more pieces came over later. Now, the reason I say all this is to really highlight that Smith & Wesson was chasing the perfected revolver this whole time, rapidly adjusting their core design to overcome every deficiency as it arose in the market. So remember, they had tried to do a big bore gun in double action. The US government went, we're gonna go small bore. So then they moved over to small bore and they did the .38 special cartridge, which is still very popular today. I mean, one of the kings of the revolver cartridges. And so they definitely had the small bore double action swing out cylinder market nailed. They definitely were gonna get the next military contract, which is when the US said, you know what, we're gonna go back to 45. As we saw last episode, Chief of Ordnance William Crozier had ordered ammunition testing in 1903, and the end result was that the US would not adopt another handgun cartridge with a diameter less than 0.45 inch. So that means the new Smith & Wesson hand ejector was going to need to bulk up, which honestly proved to be a fairly simple matter. But while they were going through the effort, why not reach back for their best locking design to really compete, that 3-point locking system back from the 1901 patent? Yeah, let's dust that thing off. So much of the development of our gun today actually ties in with the US development of a .45 caliber cartridge. Prototypes were made in both rimmed and rimless variants known as the Model 1906 cartridges. During the same period, by the way, Daniel Wesson would pass away, leaving control of his company in the hands of his 2 sons, Walter and Joseph Wesson. It is likely they were already deeply involved in development and continued their father's work uninterrupted. They alternated as president of the company for a number of years. Returning to the trials, well, those cartridges were ultimately abandoned for Colt's .45 ACP, which was developed for their Model 1905 handgun, currently in the US trials. Now we know that in the end this would result in the adoption of the 1911 handgun, and in the interim a 45 long Colt model 1909 revolver from Colt would be adopted. That big framed Smith & Wesson had actually failed the trials, and I'm going to bet a lot of that had to do with the sheer expense of making the thing. Full frame large bore Smith & Wesson of that time had a lot more going on than a Colt. Many of the features were, however, worthwhile. They just weren't very conservative on cost. One of the two Smith & Wesson revolvers submitted to the trials also failed a rust test, locking up pretty badly, again likely because of all those engaging surfaces and complexity. But it wasn't a complete loss for Smith & Wesson. They had failed to get US adoption, but the lessons that they learned during the competition were valuable. 2 additional features would be added to their new large revolvers before their commercial release. One is the cylinder stop, which was moved from the trigger to a separate rotating block, which quickly gave way to a sliding rotating block. This allowed it to pitch into place and back out of the way smoothly and positively. This was actually a feature pulled from the .38 caliber series. Also, the hammer rebound was changed in 1907. Instead of a flat spring powered tipping arm, it was now a rectangular block with internal coil spring, which served as both a rebound and hammer block. This change was also passed on to the K-Frame series and may have been created in reaction to military testing. Other minor changes were also made, and with all that wrapped together, the first of these large frame or end frame revolvers were ready for sale. Well, except they needed something to shoot. And some US experimental .45 cartridge really wasn't going to get the market excited. Instead, they had made a lot of money on the reputation of the .44 Russian cartridge, so why not build on that? They would introduce .44 Smith & Wesson Special, a hotter loaded, harder hitting .44 Russian cartridge, although the modern loadings for this are actually quite similar. And in an act of sheer genius, guns chambered for .44 Special would also be able to fire any old .44 Russian you still had handy. Honestly, smart move, backwards compatibility. And with that pairing, we get something like this right here, the Smith & Wesson New Century. These babies dropped in 1908 and are the first of the large frame or end frame Smith & Wesson revolvers. The very first marketed name was the .44 military model of 1908. Internally, they were known as the New Century, like I had said before, but popularly, they became the Triple Lock and were, at the time, easily the most advanced revolvers available, in my humble estimation. But let's take a look at why. Everything cool about this gun is in the lock, so let's take a look. I push forward on this guy and she opens up, but that seems familiar to anybody that's handled a Smith & Wesson K-Frame or anything of the like, but it works almost entirely different because what's happening is when I push forward on this, I'm driving a pin that is in, let me see if I can get where you guys can see this. I'm driving a pin in here. Okay, so that guy, and then that's driving this central pin here, this part that I'm poking on, that guy. So that's being driven forward. So when that's driven forward, it drives on this pin here, which you can see a projection in the front to see that it is being activated, which actually redirects it like a U back down this place. So when you push forward on this pin here gets dragged to the rear. And those are your 3 locking points. Lock point 1, lock point 2, lock point 3, which then correspond to this hole here, which also has a pin in it, but it's spring loaded, so it's pushing out at the moment. This hole, see if I can get that where you guys can see it. It's up under the rod. There, there we go. That hole there with its own, by the way, camming surface. That's important in a second. And then this hole here right in the center of the cylinder. So those are the 3 locking points. Now, how this works, if I close it, again, is I push, that is transferred through the center axis up to here, goes around the corner, pulls that back out, allows this to release. I'm doing this off angle. That's pretty wild. Now, when I close this, usually we're used to having a notch in the recoil shield and a spud out here, but this guy's a little different because that is all handled by this camming surface right there, which then presses up against that pin. And this is a little easier to change out than reshaping that whole recoil shield. So it's pretty cool, just crazy over-engineered. Honestly, it's over-engineered beyond any level of reasonable. Some have speculated Daniel Wesson simply wanted to prove that his company had the best manufacturing practices and the tightest tolerances out there. But let's keep digging in on this gun though. Now overall, this is one of the finest revolvers ever made. I mean, the thing is fantastic. Ridiculously smooth single action and release. God, it's nothing. Beautifully smooth double action. We already talked about this crazy swing out cylinder opening system. By the way, I did forget to mention it ejects just like anything else. You just push the whole rod up, nothing fancy there. Now, longer barrel, beautiful sights. Like, it's not a target gun, but they did have target models available, and those are even crazier and cooler. Now you can tell this once had a beautiful high finish blue that's gotten scratched over the years. 100 years and a couple world wars will do that, but realistically you can still tell how fine this was the day it came out of the factory. It would have been a marvel. So let's go ahead and take a look inside though. I'm going to get this grip plate off for you guys. Just pull that away, and then unlike the Colts, we're gonna have to flip this guy over, and we're gonna have to deal with a lot more screws. I'm sorry, I know this is riveting television. I am going to shut my mouth and speed up the footage. Sorry, I normally don't pry, but again, after a lot of age and not a lot of openings, these can be a little snug, and so I'm going as gentle as possible. Last thing you ever want to do is put even the slightest nick in this steel. So you take your thin heads, you twist ever so gently, and then boom, you're inside that beautiful action. Let me get these screws set aside gently so I don't lose them. What the heck is going on in here? Well, we have another modified Galan system, although it's a little harder to recognize because a lot more has gone into this one. We've replaced what used to be a tipping sear style arrangement with a flat spring, with a coil spring, and a strange box. And this box does a couple things. It rebounds the hammer, and you can see it pressing forward in the lower part of the hammer there. And it also keeps the hammer from being able to shove forward, although later on the military in World War II would have problems with this arrangement and add a Colt style block. Now, the other thing that you'll see are these little dots, dot, dot, dot. Those are those chafing pins that are meant to sort of set everything up against the frame and provide minimal contact while still guiding it to be absolutely centered at all times, no wandering back and forth inside the frame. Now, another thing you may see is that this also has an out of battery safety like we saw in the Colt, but it's a little different. When I am, let's see, if I open up the action a bit, sorry, give me 1 second. We'll open up the action a bit, just a bit there. Well, okay, maybe a little more than a bit, but you get the idea. And what you'll see is this guy has come forward, and as long as he's forward, the hammer cannot come back. The action is tied up. So there's your out of battery safety. Let me pop that back in. You can see that spring comes back, this guy comes back, and now we're back in business. As far as being a single and double action revolver, you've seen this a million times. We have our toe and toe for single, and our toe and hand for double. There's nothing fancy or special there. Something you may want to note though, is we have hardened steel inserts. You see how bright this is? So that's a separate piece from the actual frame, and the whole gun's set up this way so that you have the hardest, best steel for specifically fitting the parts so that there's no chance of damaging the gun or walking out of its tolerances anytime soon. And again, you can still see some of the kind of coloring of the case hardened materials in here, even 100 years later. This thing is absolutely wild. And again, just so you can see it, we have our cylinder stop here that has a sort of odd cadence walk to it, where it sort of wanders in and up. We saw that before though on our K-Frame episode. So again, one of the finest revolvers ever made. Everything in here is smooth and tight and perfect. And I'm flexing because I'm going slowly, but honestly the spring tension is very light. The release on this single action trigger is insanely light. It's a glorious work of art, and you can hear it. Just listen. Oh, just beautiful kinesthetic joy. Alright, since this is the core of our gun today, let's get a closer look with our X-ray specs and understand exactly how it works. Let's start by identifying the 3 points of contact that support the cylinder and give this gun its nickname, the triple lock. Starting with the rear, we have a long, spring-loaded pin that protrudes from the back of the cylinder when in lock. This pushes on an odd-shaped combination part inside the frame. It's both the release lever for opening the action and an out-of-battery safety that blocks the hammer whenever the cylinder is not closed. Now let's spin around to the front of the gun for the remaining 2 locking surfaces. This ramp guides another pin into lock and is the main camming surface when closing the cylinder. The pin it drives forward actually connects to another pin over top that's spun 180 degrees the other direction into the actual ejector rod head, giving you the 3rd point of locking contact. Someone was showing off. Single action is as usual on a Galland. A projection on the hammer tips against the trigger until they notch together, a slight pull, and the hammer drops. Unique to Smith & Wesson is this linear coil spring powered block. It serves as both the trigger return spring and as a hammer rebound, tipping it back for safety and convenience. Double action is again a Galland standard. Pull the trigger and its extension tips the nose fitted to the hammer, tipping said hammer back until the nose is cleared and the hammer drops. Now here is that patented cylinder stop, which is worked by another trigger extension. Once pulled, the trigger tips the stop out of the path of the cylinder, and just before full rotation to the next round, the extension clears and the cylinder stop springs back into place. Spring tension for the hand comes from inside the trigger, which has room for a pivoting arm powered by a tiny coil spring. No one should be trying to tell me that revolvers are simpler than semi-autos. Once empty, we'll open her back up and eject all 6 casings at once with a sharp push of the ejector. Now our gun here is not in 44 Special, so that means that we must have some more history to cover before we can let Mae shoot this thing. Commercially, these guns sold for $21 a pop, starting like I said in 1908, and through 1915, a little over 15,000 were produced. 13,700 or so were in 44 Special, the leading marketed cartridge, but 1,200 and some change were also made in 455. Again, like Colt, these were marked 455 LE, but were configured for British Service 455 Mark II ammunition. These were, of course, made for the international market, selling to England and Canada. Many were for sporting purposes, but do recall British officers could purchase any handgun they like. Though often it was limited to those that were in the standard service cartridge by this time. That means that the United Kingdom had at least some experience with this particular gun before war were declared. And as we well know, this war started chewing through equipment faster than it could be produced. Recall the standard sidearm of the Empire at the outbreak was the Webley Mk V, a heavy top-break single and double action revolver. Webley struggled to increase production, and it would take until 1915 for them to gain ground on the current demand, which left a gap in supplies in the meantime. So the War Office would put in orders to Colt, as we already saw, and now Smith & Wesson, beginning in August of 1914. The buying agent was actually Remington UMC, who acquired, and I've seen this multiple places, 666 triple lock revolvers. These were apparently a rush order, as the guns were taken from existing stock in 44 Special and converted rapidly to 455 at the factory before shipping out. From there, in September of 1914, a contract was signed for dedicated production. They negotiated a fairly good price of $14.50 each for, at first, 5,000 revolvers. Remington earned a 1 shilling handling fee and a 5% buyer's commission for their role in this transaction. The first adopted name for these was Smith & Wesson Blue, 6 1/2 inch barrels to take Mark II ammunition. Alright, these guns were in service, so that means Mae can finally do her bit now, so let's get it over to the range. I'm going to be honest with you, I find this to be a glorious handgun. It's much nicer than the Webleys, so you'd think the War Office would be thrilled to have them. But there was a problem. That shrouded ejector and the various interlocking surfaces, not great with mud. They were vulnerable to jamming up on reload and honestly unnecessarily complicated for both wartime use and wartime production. So the War Office would request a simplified gun, and Smith & Wesson obliged. Remember, they still had that 2-lock point barrel log on their K-frame guns, so they just brought that over to the end frame line. So that would make this what is known as the New Century second model hand ejector, or to the War Office, the Mark II. Let's get it over the light box. Weighing in at 2.4 pounds, we have apparently not saved any weight. Overall length is 11.6 inches, and our cylinder still chambers 6 .455 cartridges. The only big difference is the lack of that third locking lug. Now, as far as I can tell, this gun was wrapped up before May of 1915 and effectively ended production of the original triple lock. Some continue to be assembled here and there, and at least a handful of special orders came through in the 1930s, but mostly this guy was done. I should say also that about this time, Walter Wesson would have to retire from work. His failing health meant that he had no ability to assist in running the company. This left his brother Joseph in charge, who we'll hear more about next time. Alright, so let's take a closer look at the differences between this guy and the original, much more complicated triple lock. You want British proof marks? We are covered in them all over this gun. I mean, there and on the cylinder and probably on the back of the cylinder. I mean, they're just, I don't know that there's 3 square inches on this gun that don't have British proof marks. That's pretty cool, but that's not really the feature here. So you're gonna notice coming from the triple lock, we have a duller finish overall, and distinctly there's a lot missing up here and here on the crane for that matter. What's really happening in this system is we just have the locking point at the rear and the locking point at the front, and there's that simple pin setup, and when we push, yeah, we still get a little extension there. And what we're doing though is we're pushing through the central axis, we're aligning a gap here between the 2 pins so the internal pin sets up right at that separation point. This pin gets pushed right past that separation point. Internally we're seeing a similar thing, and boom, we're open. So we're locked here and here. Now, we are no longer guided by anything on the front of the crane, and instead it's all happening at the back on the recoil shield. So you may see a lot of wear in there. Let me see if I can, it's always torturous getting you guys the perfect camera angle, but see all that wear in the recoil shield and that divot? Well, what we're looking for is the fact that when we close this up, this spring-loaded pin, poke, 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 that guy is automatically cammed back into place, and then that snaps back. So one more time, just so you can see it, cams in, and then snaps into place, she snaps back. So internally, no real differences other than the fact that what they've done is they've gotten rid of those chafing pins and sort of gone a little easier on the fine fitting. Now, if you are not, you know, obviously dealing with a Mod 2 because of all that, they made it really easy for you because on the knuckle, they put a little numeral 2. so you know it's a second model. I could have never figured it out without that piece of help. With the British now ordering the second model, they would need to clean up the nomenclature a little bit. The list of changes would therefore record the pistol Smith & Wesson 4.55 inch with 6 1/2 inch barrel Mark I as the triple lock, and the Mark II as the second model with simplified lock. Alright, with it adopted, we can actually finally put this gun into Mae's hands and see if there's any significant difference between it and its forefather. Thank you, Mae, for your tireless service to our show. Now, the second model also served with the Canadians. As we've covered, Canada officially used the Webley, but had previously bought a fair few Colt New services in 4.55, and during the war actually picked up a contract for the Colt 1911, but those were not enough. They would order 1,500 second models in August of 1915 for $12.70 a pop. A second order would follow for 1,000 more. The price now increased to $13.72 due to increasing manufacturing costs. These were delivered by early 1916, and so they ordered 6,000 more for the same price. The last order in 1917 was for another 6,000. This time rising to $15.75, so 14,500 total Smith & Wessons for Canada. Add in our previous Colt sales, and Canada would actually end up with more American swing-out cylinder guns than they had Webleys. Those were actually mostly passed on to the British to ease their supplies, so they really became American wheel gun guys. Now, British contracts are a bit spottier. The best I can tell you is that it appears contracts continued in large numbers until September of 1916. From there, we only know of one 200-piece order in October and then nothing. Working from Smith & Wesson's numbers, it looks like roughly 60,000 were made for Britain before the contracts ended. By this time, the Empire had 4 emergency 4.55 revolvers. The triple lock had been halted first, and earlier in 1916 they had dropped the Spanish clones for poor quality. Finally, Colt and Smith & Wesson were let go as well, thanks to production of the new Webley Mk VI finally catching up. Those last two did a great job, but they were just not standard and added complexity to the parts supply. Unlike Colt, the Smith & Wesson was always a second standard gun in the Empire, and so comments on them are just about non-existent. So as far as how soldiers felt about them, I can't say. We can tell, however, that they were rugged duty weapons and not a bit worse than the standard sidearm, which is probably the best you could ever hope for when you're looking for a replacement. They also managed to survive post-war. Resuming commercial production, Smith & Wesson would drop the triple lock for the second model, now offered in 44 Special. Second models, now in 45 Long Colt, were also purchased by the Canadian Royal Mounted Police, only roughly 700 in total though. In the 1930s, the shrouded ejector would return, most notably on the Smith & Wesson Registered Magnum. This commercial 38 caliber end frame had a special high velocity cartridge and retains a bit of a Colt legacy. While the shroud has returned, the third locking point did not, and this retains the same 2 locking points as a second model. So don't let a casual glance at a Model 27 or 28 confuse you. There is only one triple lock. During World War II, the Canadian forces would refield their 4.55s. Mostly these were issued to the Navy, who ordered another 300 replacement guns from Smith & Wesson, which isn't a lot, honestly, but that's because they were now locked onto that 38-200 cartridge and the Smith & Wesson K-Frame, later nicknamed the Victory. In the scramble for arms, Britain would also import and otherwise buy up whatever reasonable revolvers they could get their hands on. Often very happy to have back any Smith & Wessons in 4.55, but numbers are unavailable for how many they refilled in World War II. So the Second War use of these guns was a bit more reserve duty than frontline. Now I know a lot of you are lusting after the next gun in this lineage, the N-frame in 45 ACP, but like the Colt, that comes in part 2. So for now, let's get Mae in here and have her give us a rundown on shooting these big old guns. All right, once more we have Mae, and we have another big wheel gun. I hope you guys aren't getting fatigued on these, because we are in what is going to be a third of 4 episodes, and then we're going to go back to some wilder stuff. But this is important history, and these guns often get confused for each other. I'd really like you guys to know the differences, because there are pretty big differences. But for right now, let's get this guy over to Mae, who is now holding what many consider to be the ultimate revolver, period. Like, some people consider this to be the best revolver ever engineered. Let's see what her actual opinion is, starting with the ergonomics.
Honestly, guys, this is a beautiful piece of work. I really am excited to get into this. It's not so heavy. Like, you're seeing this giant chunk of metal up here, thinking that she looks like she's got a lot of heft to her. Surprisingly not. She is very well balanced, fairly long, don't get me wrong, but she's not front heavy, which was a pleasant surprise. Honestly, this grip right here is the king of the revolver grips so far, I would say. Simply because it's just got this wonderful bell shape to it. It's got a nice extra little flare here at the bottom that curves under your palm, which is beautiful. It bells out a little bit right here so that it actually goes into your palm. So where your palm curves out and in, that fits right into that little nook and cranny right there. And then at the top, it tapers in right here. Beautiful. Like, I want to say the work that went into this grip for that design, it's amazing. It really, truly is. And it's perfect. Like, right where I naturally grip it is where I'm going to shoot it as well, which is beautiful. Like, it doesn't feel like I have to loosen or weird or change my grip any. It feels like it naturally falls into place. I mean, maybe someone with bigger hands or different hands might feel differently, but for me, it was perfect. Interestingly enough, right where my grip falls, my thumb is almost, it's kind of natural to have it either right where I'm going to shoot it or to be able to pop open the cylinder. Like, it's a really easy placement for this push button right here. And funnily enough, unlike the Colts, which it was kind of awkward and I had to displace my hand a little bit, no, this one, I don't really have to move my hand from the grip at all. So, I'm shooting, bang, bang, bang. I go to open, and it's just like that easy. And I can close her back up and I'm ready to shoot again. My grip does not have to change at all with this, which is fantastic. Granted, I will say the Colts do have the advantage here in that in terms of longevity, that over time, this is going to get a little bit stiffer to manipulate. It's not going to be as smooth.
So this is interesting. Smith & Wesson kind of made a sacrifice here without realizing it. So I've been trying to think of how best to visualize this, but and by the way, how awesome is that button for being able to steer the revolver while you're loading onward?
Oh, I know. It's fantastic. Basically, I can use this as a place of purchase so that my pointer finger right here, it just is able to easily push up against it. Like, it's beautiful.
You go from the balancing, clawing act of the Colt to this, and it's just one change in direction and a thumb pad gives you so much more control of the gun. Now, sorry, we were going to talk about the reason why this doesn't last as long. You may find with a lot of older Smith & Wessons that especially have been played with repeatedly to open and close, the way they work is there's essentially a rod that pushes up against another rod, and then there's the plane at which you want the frame to break free of the cylinder. And so when the button is back, you have a piece of rod that's blocking the way. And then when you push the button forward, it pushes the gap between those two rods, which have rounded heads, aligns with the gap between the frame and the cylinder, and then that allows it to separate. And what happens is over time and wear, they move a little bit off that center line. Yes, they're domed, so you can still get it open, but you're fighting the taper. So a lot of people may see that as these get older, They'll file the heads a little bit. They'll polish them off just a little bit to get them smooth again because they've sort of compressed slowly over time. That is one disadvantage coming from the Colt because the Colts tend to just open up because they just have the drawback and that's it.
But that's a disadvantage you don't really have to worry about until like it's like 50 years down the line. So it's not something that during wartime you're really something having to worry about. Just an interesting note that we wanted to make sure we made.
Yeah, that misalignment doesn't happen if you've purchased the gun within the 20 years of whenever and using it actively in the military. Like, no, you're not going to have any problems. It's after it's been around for a good long bit.
But absolutely, this is a beautiful gun, guys. It inherently is easier to manipulate, which is fantastic. The only other really interesting thing I guess I could say about it is the difference in the front sight on this one and then probably the hammer. The front sight, I will say, probably comparing it to the Colts, it's not quite as easy to read because the Colt, thank you, it has a little shark fin up here, and I'll show it in this camera for better view, that doesn't cause as much shadow, and I would say it's just naturally easier to see. Even though this Smith & Wesson sight is taller, for me, it's just harder to read.
Yeah, that triangular style front sight really puts some shadow on the back end of the sight. It's not as good for getting in and out of holsters sometimes, although this I doubt would snag on anything. And we kind of saw this with our Nagant episode. If you have a textured reverse side to your front sight, it stands sharper in relief to the horizon or whatever you're pointing at. And so the half penny front sight, this half moon front sight that's rounded, the top of it doesn't stand out as sharply. It doesn't pick up shadow and light as well. It can get reflective at times. So I would agree with May. I tend to prefer a triangular style front sight over a half moon, but still reads fairly well. They're pretty comparable otherwise.
But yeah, the only other real thing is just if I guess just talk about single and double action on this one. And honestly, it's still beautiful. God, it's so smooth. Maybe, I guess if I were to say, if I had to compare the two, Colts, the 1909 might be a little bit smoother. Maybe, but
I don't
God,
believe it.
it's hard. It's really hard to kind of see the difference. It just feels so good. It is lighter.
To my finger, that has been the smoothest revolver we've had.
It's beautiful. It truly is. But yeah, ergonomically, this thing sang.
Yeah. So what about, well, this is a triple lock specifically. So this has 3 locking points. Mm-hmm. I doubt you can feel it when you're handling the gun, though.
No, you can't feel anything at all. It's smooth all the way through.
And that's kind of interesting because, you know, the triple lock, you'd think May would know something about it. You know, the fact that it locks triply would come through. But realistically, what that triple lock is doing is it's preventing the gun from coming out of time over decades. So we're unaffected by it. The fact that the gun is not shaving rounds is a testament to the fact that it's the triple lock. But we're going to find out that you don't need all 3 locking points to have a gun that's 100 years old that does not shave rounds. This one right here in my hand, the second model, has only 2 locking points. And I'd like to know if I can trade you, other than sort of the poorer bluing quality, does that stand out as any different from this, the triple lock?
Yeah, in terms of opening, accessing, closing her back up, not really that perceivable of a difference. I mean, I honestly can't feel anything, but overall, if I were to compare the two, this one has seen some wartime use. Like it's definitely does not feel quite as smooth as the triple lock. So yeah, in the locking action, no real difference. Everything else, it's just not as polished feeling.
True, and by the very nature that is a second model for the British, we know that was made for wartime production, unless it happens to be one of the few that were for Canada post-war, but this has no Canadian markings. This is British. So it's a wartime British production. We know the few years it was made in a hurry. I think the fit and finish kind of dialed back in order to really get the product through. I don't think it's quite as smooth. I would compare that to, weirdly, to a wartime Colt. They're basically the same, although that one's got a lighter spring than the Colt we tried, but that was a one-off. So I'd say comparable, very good, smooth action, smoother than many of the other actions we've handled and said good things about, but not quite. The problem is we've got the King of Kings. I mean, this thing is fantastic.
Oh yeah, it's beautiful. Like you really, it's hard to kind of describe it. It's so incrementally better than the other ones. Like each one, if you were to go through stages, you'd be like, oh, it's a little bit better than this one, this one, this one. Then you finally get to this one and like, I haven't felt anything better than this.
A novice would not be able to tell the difference between these two guns, I don't think. I think you'd have to have some level of shooting experience to get that incremental change. but it's there and it's good. So we haven't talked about shooting either of these yet. They're both the same weight. They're both the same grip. They're both the same barrel length. Yes, the trigger's a little better on one than the other, but is there any appreciable difference between El Bango on both of them?
Not really. I honestly couldn't feel a difference. And to be fair, that was kind of expected, with the exception of manipulating the hammer, and the trigger's not quite as smooth as the other one. There's no real perceivable difference in recoil. They just didn't feel any different for me in terms of the grip, because the grip is identical too, I want to say. So for me, I couldn't notice a difference, and I want to say my groupings really weren't that different either.
They were different, so I'm calling shenanigans. You grouped better with the second model than you did with the triple lock. And I'm going to tell you that proves, because of the comments and the way I think about things, is that it must be that one's better, and you're just blowing this up. Or before you guys start typing your whole paragraphs, it could be that she shot this one first for the entire day and then settled into shooting big frame revolvers and just did incrementally better the more she shot big frame revolvers that were comparable.
That might be noticeable as the episodes grow.
It was like the first gun she shot that day. That was probably the fourth gun she shot that day. I think you were just in your groove by the time you got to the second model.
Probably. That sounds about right. Typically, I tend to do better as the day goes on, especially when I'm getting used to the same feeling over and over again.
And then it falls off real fast.
Shut up. Yes, it does.
Exhaustion is one heck of a thing. Comparable shooting. What was shooting like, though? I mean, really.
Really, like any revolver, I expected some good rock with it, which there was. Really, truly, I expected, because the triggers still have some good bit of weight to them, I still expected, I guess, my shots to be a little bit wider than what they were, but was surprisingly pleased when I did better, or did pretty well with them throughout the day. But yeah, unfortunately, the sights just aren't quite as readable as I would have liked them to have been, so that's an unfortunate downside to it. We've had to shoot some abysmally short sights throughout this series.
Yeah, they're kind of a weird hybrid. You have this nice tall front sight and this pretty shallow rear sight, so you can find the front sight in a hurry and then drop it in, and then I guess at some point you're like, okay, good enough, I'm in there. Then you pull the trigger. And so we're kind of used to having a larger group with big bore World War I revolvers. But these I felt like were a little tighter than the usual big bore revolver. Okay, so would you prefer these over the Colt?
The 1909 Colt was pretty good,
Better
but
than that?
I'm probably going to get some bad comments on this because there's some pretty hardcore Colt fans out there. I really probably prefer both of these over the Colts that we've shot so far.
I'm a Smith & Wesson person myself.
It's just because, honestly, this right here, it's just so natural compared to the other one.
The engineer in me wants to like Colt because they solved that crane problem by just flipping it around, whereas Smith & Wesson kept the crane problem and over-engineered a solution. But their over-engineered solution is much better for human ergonomics, in my mind.
And this grip, this probably is what puts him over the others for me. This grip alone is just phenomenal. I cannot stress that enough. It makes a huge difference.
You love the Colt grip.
I did. And honestly, I thought, like I was saying, like that was one of my favorite grips I've handled so far. This has topped that out. It's got such a natural curve with it that it goes out and in again and out again so that it curves with your palm. And you really can't notice it unless you're looking at it. And it's beautiful. It truly is. They were thinking of the human hand when they designed this.
Not only that, but we forgot to mention something in the last episode. These didn't bite you.
No, they didn't.
You may have noticed some bandages and tape showing up. That's because the Colt 1909, I believe, took a chunk out of your hand, and we forgot to mention that last episode.
It's still healing. That took like about a week and a half to heal there.
It was just the nature of where the metal meets up with the grips, and over time the grips had shrunk, just dried out and things like that. They weren't pressed up in there as well, and the frame of the Colt got her just right.
Well, if you notice, the Smith & Wessons, they're actually a little bit smoother around that area too, so these wouldn't have bitten me even with the wood missing in that area.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, so you like the Smith & Wessons, and you said yes to the Colt, so you must say yes to both of these, right? There's no way you wouldn't want to take this one into battle unless there was some sort of, some sort of secret Achilles heel that might make that not entirely desirable.
Man, guys, I don't know what he could possibly be talking about unless you're paying attention to the episode, then you know. Unfortunately, I cannot take this gun. As much as I love it, as much as it was the best one I've shot for the series so far, this shroud right here, returning the ejection rod, is the failure on this gun is what's going to get it a no for me taking it into war. Unfortunately, it even failed during US trials because it gunked up and rusted up so bad that it became unusable. And I totally believe the British that they were expressing the same issues. It can just get crowded in there with so much mud and gunk that it just becomes unusable. I totally see it. And as much as I love it, as much as this has been my top revolver so far in terms of experience, it has to get a no. Now, this Mod 2, on the other hand, this one I would absolutely take into war because, like, if this gets sealed at any point, I can take a hammer and, like, knock it to the side or whatever.
It's not going to, though. The gunk can fall right back out of there.
Right. There's no real concerns I have with this one like I did with the triple lock. Unfortunately, I just can't say yes to that one, but I absolutely will say yes to this one.
And to be fair, the triple lock is over-engineered. Like, this gun is glorious, but it doesn't need the shroud. Like,
no.
it's fulfilling something to keep it sort of alive a little longer, but really we're hedging such a small portion of its lifespan for all this extra metal.
It's amazing.
The second model is the right way to go, and that's why they kept doing it, and they never went back, by the way. They came, Model 27, Model 28, we mentioned them, look like it. They have the shroud because it looks nice, it presents well, but they never went back to putting in that triple locking system.
It's unfortunate because that has been, like I said, it has been the top dog, it really has, and unfortunately just that single shroud brings it an instant no.
But a finally finished second model, maybe commercial production from post-war, you might be able to get all the same advantages out of this without having to deal with that extra locking surface. So, you're comparing a wartime gun to a peacetime gun with an extra accessory on it.
They had time with that one. I get it. It makes a difference. And in this instance, it made a difference between a yes and no if I would take it into battle.
That thing is a beast, by the way, and this thing is a statement. And I would rather have the beast in a battlefield.
Same here.
So I think that's got us all covered up, unless you have anything else to say on these guys?
Nothing much other than absolutely enjoyed shooting all of these revolvers so far, and I'm going to be a bit sad when the revolvers are done with.
Yeah, I was going to say, and by the way, she is totally biased towards Smith & Wesson.
We've shot all of them now. Comparing them, they've inherently done a little bit better for me.
Well, I think that's got us covered, so we're going to wrap this one out. Updates are after the credits. Have a good one.
Night, everybody.
All right, gang, this is a very generic update because I'm filming it a week in ahead. I don't know what's going on, so check Instagram or Patreon or any little subsidiary videos I might have done to explain why everything's on fire or not on fire. In the meantime, if you like the show and you want to support it, head on over to Patreon, head on over to Subscribestar, and kick in $1 or $2, and we'll keep making the episodes. Have a good one.